Welcome to the 8th presentation in the series where we're looking at Paul's letter to the Romans. We're looking now at chapter 4 where Paul focuses on Abraham. The letter to the Romans, the example of Abraham. Let's just look back for a moment or two at something of what the previous presentations have been showing to us. God's righteousness. God is perfect, morally, ethically, in every way. That's his nature. And God's nature shows in his actions. So God is faithful. He is completely reliable and keeps his promises. Always. God is love. God's agenda is always the best for you and me. That word is a word of action, not emotion. God's anger. God is angry against anything or anyone that messes up anything in his creation. It's not emotional anger, but it's like a parent being angry when their child is hurt. And sometimes it leads to God's judgment. In some cases God intervenes to put things right. But sometimes he leaves things to run their course where we face the inevitable consequences for our actions. God's actions, they show something of his nature. Now we're not righteous. And Paul gives us three pictures and analogies about how the righteousness of God can be made available to us, how we can be made acceptable to him. They come in three words, and they're all part of the culture and the environment of the days of Paul. Redemption is the word of the slave market. Justification, the word of the law court. Atonement, the word of sacrifice. So what Jesus has done is pictured. It's like someone coming into a slave market, buying the slaves, paying the price, and then breaking the chains and setting them free. Jesus comes, and because of what he did in his life, death and resurrection, we're declared not guilty in God's law court. We're acceptable to him. There's nothing held against us. We have the status of righteousness. Doesn't mean we're perfect, but we're free to go, free to live. And atonement. Well, people brought the best that they had and sacrificed it to their God. God offered the best in Jesus. Sacrificed him on a cross to set mankind free, that we might walk free and move into life. There's the pictures that Paul gives to us. And Paul uncovers a very important principle. It's the law of works. That's the most common in the world today, and it always has been. We try to earn God's favour by our self-effort. We try to keep the rule book so that God will be pleased with us and will accept us. And that's what we say. Essentially, we're saying we're good enough with our self-effort to do it for ourselves. And if we think about it for a moment, it's laughable that we puny human beings could ever be good enough for the God who made the universe. But Paul pictures the alternative, the law of faith. The law of faith is where we accept what God has given to us. It's a faith response. Faith is not an intellectual word, it's a word of action, it's a word of doing, it's a word of response. Faith response. We accept that God says, you can't do it yourself, you're not good enough. But I have done it for you. Accept the gift. That's the picture that Paul has painted. And that leads to quality lifestyle. Because we're now free from the eternal round of self-effort and failure. We're free, and God resources us and equips us to live the way of Jesus. That's the picture that Paul has painted. He summarizes it this way. For we maintain that a person, any person, is justified. Justified, that is the word of the law court. We're accounted not guilty. The state is nothing against us. You're free to go. You're free to live. A person is justified by faith, not a word of intellect, a word of response, apart from the works of the law. In other words, you can't earn it. And when we recognize we can't earn it, and we recognize that God has done it for us, then we can receive it. But our response is critical. Now let's move on, because it raises an interesting question. Did Paul invent this theology? Did Paul invent these ideas? Indeed, did Paul invent Christianity? Now there are people today, it's quite a modern phenomenon, but it's people today are actually suggesting this. It seems to be a fashion in some worlds of theology. Come up with the most outrageous ideas possible and you get a reputation. Well, you get a reputation, but it doesn't help people. Did Paul invent this? In the Islamic world, Muslims are specifically taught it. You'll find it in books, textbooks. That Paul changed the religion of Jesus and invented something, and they of course reject it, because they teach all the time that it's your self-effort to win God's favour and your place in paradise. But is it true? Did Paul change what Jesus did? Did he invent some new kind of religion? Now the only way we can judge this is to look for the evidence. And I invite you to look at what Paul presents to us as evidence. The evidence that the way of faith, trusting God for what he has done for us, rather than trying to put in the effort to impress him. Now when we trust God for what he has done for us, he releases us to the quality living and empowers us to make it possible. But we're not doing it to impress God. We're doing it as a response to what he has done for us. Now what's the evidence that this is Paul's invention, or that this goes right back and is a principle of the universe? Now we've got to remember that Paul did not have the gospel accounts that we have in our New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. These four were written in the 1st century. To the best of our knowledge, there are no others that are first-hand accounts of the life of Jesus. All the other gospels that exist were written much later. The earliest of the other ones is probably late 2nd century. They're not first-hand accounts. So the four that we've got are first-hand accounts, written by people who saw the events or had contact directly with people who saw the events. But Paul didn't have them. They hadn't yet been written. Paul's writings were written earlier than our four Gospels, so he didn't have them. And we don't know whether Paul did expect criticism. He got lots of criticism from the Jewish people, but did he expect wider criticism? We don't know. Paul does something which is much more fundamental. He now takes us right back to the life of Abram. That's about 2,000 years earlier. And he shows that God related to Abram in exactly the same way that Paul has described here. So Paul did not invent this. Now come with me and see if the evidence stacks up. Paul writes, "What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abram was justified by works, that's by self-effort, he is something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say?" And Paul quotes Genesis 15:6. "Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness." You're back to this word, God gave it to him. Abraham responded by faith. Going on now, to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the one who does not work, but trusts God who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness. And then Paul goes to the life of David. David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Righteousness not depending on self-effort. "Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them." That's a key verse. And it's very early in the biblical account. Very early in the life of Abram as recorded. And David is giving the same message. God accepts us as we are, through all that he is and has done for us. He knows that we can't impress him by our self-effort. He wants to release us to quality living, yes. But he takes the initiative and does for us what we can't do for ourselves. So there's a summary. Abram responded to God in faith. Now that's not an intellectual word, it's a word of obedience. And on the basis of that response, Abram was given the status of righteousness. In the eyes that Paul would use, the court. You're not guilty, you're free to go, the state has nothing against you. I accept you. So Paul has taken us right back to Abraham. Going on, is this blessedness only for the circumcised, that's for the Jew, or also for the uncircumcised, the non-Jew? We've been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that the righteousness might be credited to them. It predates the ritual of circumcision. Historically, that's true. He is then also the father of the circumcised, who are not only are circumcised but also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abram had before he was circumcised. In other words, faith response to what God has done holds the key. It wasn't through the law, no, not self-effort. It was not through the law that Abram and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who depend on the law are heirs, faith means nothing. The promise is worthless, because the law brings wrath. And where there is no law, there is no transgression. Paul looks at the circumstances. Before circumcision, and about 400 years before the law of Moses was even given. Law codes didn't exist at the time of Abraham. Predates it. That's the summary. In other words, outward religious symbolisms and self-effort came later. There's a principle here that Paul has gone right back to. He didn't invent this. He goes on, therefore the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace, God doing for us what we can't do for ourselves, and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are of the law, that's the Jew, but also to those who have the faith of Abraham, that's anyone. He is the father of us all. He set the principle. As it is written, I've made you a father of many nations. He is our Father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that are not. Against all hope, Abram in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it has been said to him, so shall your offspring be, quoting Genesis 15:5. Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. The words "it was credited to him" were written not for him alone, but also for us, to whom God will credit righteousness, for us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He was delivered over to death for our sins and was raised to life for our justification. Two key words: grace and faith. God takes the initiative and does for us what we do not deserve, cannot do for ourselves, but he requires us to respond to his gift. That's faith. Now, Abram did have doubts, and Abram made many mistakes. But deep down, Abraham never lost this conviction that God would keep his promises. And Abram received a status before God. He was accepted by God. And Paul takes it now back into the New Testament era. This was all achieved because of what Jesus came to do in his life, death, and in his resurrection. And he releases our justification, the last word, our status before God. You see, Paul is making the point that this principle of grace started right from the beginning. He didn't invent it. It starts right with Abraham. God did for Abram what he could not do for himself, and he didn't deserve. And despite Abram's mistakes and failures, Abram responded, obeyed. That's faith. He took God seriously and acted accordingly. That's the real meaning of faith. So Paul has taken us right back to first principles. Let me summarize this. Paul shows that the life of Abram shows the same principle at work. This runs right throughout the Old Testament. And if we look at the gospel accounts, which we have today but Paul didn't have, you can see it in the teaching of Jesus. It is consistent. But Paul can't, of course, address that issue because the books were not written. You see, if we try to earn our favour, then we put God under some kind of obligation. But Abraham, a wandering nomad, God says to this man, "You're acceptable in my sight, a status of righteousness, because you took me seriously when I did it for you, and much of it was promise. It predates religious ritual. It predates even the coming of the law code by hundreds of years. It's a fundamental principle. And it opened the door to Abram being acceptable to God." And if you look at the life of Abraham, you can see it being worked out. We'll look at the beginning part just in a moment or two. And the good news of Jesus, all he said, did, taught, it all fits this long-term consistent way. That's why Jesus was at odds with the religious leaders of his day, because they'd lost it. And he was bringing them back to the true way of Abraham. It's a pattern. And it's open to everyone who responds to God, no matter what your religious pedigree. But it does depend on our response to God's initiative. If we think we can do it ourselves, when we cut ourselves off from God's initiative. But we have to respond to what he has done. It's the only way. And that's a point that Paul has stressed so strongly in his letter to the Romans. Paul has presented that. If you like, the life of Abram's a kind of model, a picture, a pattern. Shows the way God comes to human beings. And it shows the way this particular human being responded. He took God seriously when God spoke and promised things, and he acted accordingly. That holds the key. And that's what Paul has been teaching in this letter. That's what Jesus came to teach. And the idea that Paul invented something different does not fit the evidence, no matter how we look at the evidence. And the idea that Paul threw out the true teaching of Jesus and invented his own kind of Christianity, as is taught in the Islamic world, does not fit the evidence. Evidence always must stand up and be looked at carefully, coldly, calmly, and weighed. That was the key verse. Key words are there. Believed, that's the same word in the Hebrew language this time as faith. Taking God seriously and acting accordingly. It's nothing to do with an intellectual response. And God gives, credited to. That's his grace. He gave Abram a status, an acceptance. And these words, if we put it, the translation of what the original Hebrew words might mean, you could put it that kind of a way. Abram was accounted to him a righteousness, a status, that it didn't really belong to him. He didn't earn it. He had to accept it, if it was to be his. But let's look at the context, because that's very important. So we're going to look at the life of Abram very briefly. God had instructed Abram to leave the land of his forefathers. He'd ended up in this land of Canaan, and he was promised a land for his offspring. But he's getting on in years. But he'd been promised a son. How is that possible? I'd been promised to father numerous descendants. See, he didn't have a son to do it through. But Abram hung on to what God was saying, even when it seemed impossible. And he accepted that it would happen. That's the kind of context where this is said. If we look at these verses again, or part of them, there's a word that occurs again and again. I'm not going to read this through, but just look at the word, promise, 5 times. God spoke to Abram and gave him promises. And even though he had all kinds of doubts and made many mistakes, Abram hung on to these promises and lived his life out and the life of his little family out in response to these promises. This was going to happen. And he hung on. Now there's an example of faith. Abraham took God seriously and acted accordingly. Now he made mistakes, but the key was God accepted him, because Abraham took God seriously and acted accordingly. The story is this. Abram's father Terah took his son and his grandson and Abraham's wife, and they went up from Ur to Canaan. But when they came to a place called Haran, they settled there. The problem was Terah was an old man, and he died while they stayed at Haran. At that point God said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." And here's the first set of promises. "I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Now history shows how true that has been. What would Abram have made of that? But he took it seriously and he acted accordingly. So he set off. He followed God's instructions. His nephew and his nephew's wife were with him. And they set out for the land of Canaan. And they arrived there. They travelled through this land. And 1 or 2 places are named. Shechem right in the centre. There were scattered communities of peoples in the land. The land was basically owned by Egypt. They were called Canaanites. And the promise was repeated. And he built an altar there. And he went on towards the hills east of Bethel, further south. And he built an altar there. Just stones piled one on top of the other. Then you've travelled to the south of the land, called the Negev. Abraham took God's instructions seriously, and he acted accordingly. Here's the map. That's where it started. Now there's a lot of unrest at the time when Terah, Abram's father, was alive, and that may have been the trigger that caused them to move north. God told them to move. And they went up the Euphrates Valley. Now they had flocks to look after, servants. And it's a long way. And they walked it. And Terah was in old age. They stopped in Haran, somewhere kind of at the Syria, Turkey area of today. Terah died. God came back and reappeared to Abram and told him where you're to go. There's the land of Canaan, part of the Egyptian Empire. So Abram travelled south. And if you carry the arrow right to the south of the land, it's a long way. And it's over a mountain range that will be snow-covered. It cost Abram quite a lot to uproot his family and his flocks and his possessions, a wandering nomad, and travelled that kind of distance in those days. This would cause major problems. He went to Shechem, Bethel, and then went to the south to the Negev. He travelled throughout the land, a land that God was saying, your descendants will possess this land, they'll own it. Now there were problems for Abraham. It was a long journey. They had flocks and possessions to keep together, and they did not have maps. It was over a mountain range. Problems of security and safety. Food and water supply would always be difficulties. Health risks. Going to an unknown destination. That was Abraham. He took God seriously and acted accordingly. And because of that response to God's initiative, Abram was accepted by God. The principle is there. How much did Abram understand? Probably not a lot. He predates the times of Jesus by at least 2,000 years. Did he know how to worship God? He was probably discovering and learning. He didn't have a Bible. Didn't exist. He had to depend directly on listening to God. There was no Old Testament law. That came 400 years later. And did he really grasp where all this was leading? Interesting questions if we try and put our feet in the shoes of Abram at the time. You see, faith is a love response to God. We don't have all the answers. Abraham certainly didn't. But we listen to God, take God seriously at what he says, and we act accordingly. Now we know that God came to Abram directly through human beings with divinity upon them coming into Abram's life. The story is given to us. There were all kinds of visions and dreams and activities. For us today, how do we hear God's word and act accordingly? How do we know what God is saying to us? Because we have the record. Abram didn't have that. The story of the coming of Jesus, his life, his death and resurrection, it's all known, it's all documented, it's all confirmed. It's not make-believe. And it was written down by numerous people who saw the events and were there at the time. And indeed, his life and death are confirmed in Roman records. But God does still speak to us today directly. Now what we need to know is how to learn to listen to his voice and to discern his voice from all the other voices that are speaking to us. God gave these promises. We're back to that word to Abraham. It came true. The days of David, it was an empire. And the promise was given numerous times. It came true because through that nation Jesus was born. And if you look at the world today, the impact of Jesus in the world today, 2 billion at least follow Jesus. And the promise was given several times. Possessing the land. Physically it was a land. When we look at the book of Hebrews, we see it moves beyond a physical land. But we can't expand that at the moment. And the promise was given several times. These are the promises of God when God spoke to Abram and Abraham responded appropriately. And it was credited to him as righteousness. He took God seriously, acted accordingly. And God gave him the status of righteousness. You're free to live. You're equipped to live. The importance of faith. Remember, the word faith and believed is the same word in the original languages. It's a love response to what God is saying. And the word righteousness, the same word in the original language, is justification. God accepting us as we are, without preconditions. He does it for us. But he requires our faith response. Acceptable as a status, free to live. And it came before the religious ritual, and it came before the giving of a law code. This is what Paul is demonstrating, historical facts. What Paul is uncovering here is not his invention. But it came after Abram had responded to God and had moved 400 miles south. Summarizing this, Abram accepted God's promise. He didn't have proof. The trouble is, today people will then look at me and say things to me, prove it. Well, in a sense, coming from my scientific background, nothing is provable in that sense. I may make a slight exception when I move into the world of mathematics. We trust God on the basis of evidence and act accordingly. He keeps his promises. We're not good enough to impress God. And it's laughable to think we are. But that's what religion tries to present. Abram made many mistakes. He had all kinds of doubts and hang-ups. But he had rock-solid trust. He hung on to that promise when it was apparently impossible. And the son was born. And the nation came into being. God did what we cannot do for ourselves. And he did it in the life of Abram, he does it for us. But we are required to respond and act accordingly. God always takes the initiative, but he does require human response. The word for that is grace. The word literally meaning God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves and we do not deserve. And the human response, the biblical word for that is faith. Faith is not an intellectual word. Faith is listening and responding to what God is saying and what God has done and acting accordingly. We hear the story of Jesus. We start to begin to understand a little of what he's done for us. We don't have to understand it all, but we take it seriously. And we say, I want to come into the kingdom of Jesus. I want Jesus to be my king. I want to live for him. And God says, you're welcome to come in. There are no entry conditions. Come on in. I've opened the door through all that Jesus did in his life, death, and resurrection. You're acceptable to me. And in the kingdom, God releases to us by his Spirit the resources to enable us to live. It's a kind of sequence. God comes to us to enable us to respond. But there is a responsibility on us. You can't get proof. It doesn't exist in anything. Listen to what God is saying. Look at the evidence. Take it seriously. Act accordingly. And we recognize we're not good enough to impress God. You can't do it. We can't do it. God knows that. He knows us better than we know ourselves. He's done it for us. And he accepts us. We focus on the promise like Abraham, not the impossibility. That's the picture in the life story of Abraham. And it puts the focus back on God. You see, if we do it by self-effort or try to do it that way, we very quickly go down the route of pride. I have seen this so often in the Islamic world, where Muslims have often expressed this considerable sense of achievement when they do something when they keep the Ramadan fast for the entire month without breaking it. I've heard them actually say, I'm so proud I've done it. God will be pleased. Now stop for a minute and think. God, the God of the universe, is any of us good enough to impress him? And they're trying to impress him. It's too easy for that to go towards pride. But recognizing we can't, but he does it for us. That's a kind of antidote to pride. What a beautiful picture Paul has painted for us here. There are the two key words, grace and faith. They run right throughout this letter. God's initiative, God's promises, God's invitation. Jesus came and said, the kingdom of God is at hand. Basically he's saying it's here, come on in, you're welcome. God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Because God's agenda is love, and he keeps his promises. But it's only real when we respond. Our human response, we call it a faith response, our acceptance. It isn't basically intellectual, it's spiritual. We take God at his word. We look at what Jesus said and did. We take God at his word and we say, yes, that's the way I want to go. I want to be a member of his kingdom. I want to live the way of Jesus. So help me God. That's the way of faith responding to grace. And the two come together beautifully. You see, we've got problems in our kind of religious thoughts of today. Being declared accepted by God is kind of woven into the fabric of all religions. There are some who say that you are born into the religion of your father. These people often just ignore the mother. Doesn't work that way. You can't inherit your status before God. We can't impress God by religious performance. I am saddened when I see all the enormous effort and expenditure of time and money and resources in religious performance, in the magnificent buildings, in the ritual performance. Do this, do that, and it must be done this way, in this order, by this person. Do you think God, the God of the universe, is impressed by that? Our most glorious buildings in religious performance are nothing. And in the Old Testament you'll find that taught specifically. And we think that by our puny self-effort we can win our place in paradise. Oh, how sad. Because it ends up with frustration and disillusionment. And it ends up with no confidence or certainty. Because we keep on having to do more and more and more when we never seem to get there. Because it's impossible. It comes this way. We recognize we're not good enough. We can't do it. God has done it for us through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But our response is important. It doesn't come automatically, but it's offered to all, irrespective of your background, religion, upbringing, your gender, your country, your colour, irrespective of anything and everything. It's offered to all. And all are invited to respond. And what Paul is saying here is, look back at the life of Abraham, and he quotes the records. Look back at the life of Abraham. You can see this whole principle working out in practice. The life of Abram illustrates it. I didn't invent it, says Paul. It's all there. And if you look at the stories in the Gospels, look at the Old Testament, and look at Paul's writings, there is, as the great scholars have often seen, this incredible consistency, considering the diversity of background and language that was used. The same principles are seen to be working out in practice. So we have to say no, no, no. And when pseudo-intellectual theology tries to suggest that, or it's taught in Islamic textbooks, just stop and think. What's the evidence? And I invite you to go and look at the evidence, weigh the evidence, go back and read the stories of Abraham in the book of Genesis. What does it illustrate? And then look at this chapter in Romans where Paul has summarized it. Now, Paul's language is condensed, compressed, and accurate. That's Paul's writing style, or his dictating style. But did he invent it? No. He summarized it, intellectualized it perhaps, brought it together. But it's the same principle and pattern. Paul's talked about justification, the status of acceptance before God. And in the world then, and indeed in the world today, but I'm going to use today as the illustration, 3 ways of looking at getting our acceptance before God. You can set up standards of behavior, and you've got some kind of baseline of a minimum of standard. You've got to do this, this, and this to this level, and God will accept you. Now, it's a kind of self-effort system with fairness, except that it's not fair really, because we all start at different starting points in life with different baselines. And some of us have great support with the people around us to make it possible. Others do not have that. Now, to get anybody to get over the standards have to be not too high. And that gives you the kind of patronizing religion where the religious leader pats you on the head and says, "Don't worry, you tried your best." I've called this religious thinking. And it's common in all religion, including, sadly, in the church. But one religion has got a slight difference. This religion accepts that we set up the standards of behavior. It often suggests that God gave it to us, but we leave it open to God to accept whom He will accept, because God is sovereign. The trouble with that is there is no fairness. Because will God accept you depends on if you like His mood in the day. Because we're not getting criteria, judgment standards, they can vary. We leave God to take the decisions. But it leaves it open as that the decisions are based on criteria that are fixed or not fixed. Now, if you look at Islamic teaching, that's what it is saying. Now, my Muslim friends would deny this. They would argue against it. But in practice, as I've studied it and studied their literature, that's what's being said. The third way is that God knows that we can't do it by self-effort. So He provides the way, but we are invited to choose it, to accept it. Grace with a faith response. It accepts God knows that we can't do it by self-effort, no matter how hard we try. And what Paul has demonstrated is that this is biblical. It goes right back to Abram, first principles. It was not invented. And Paul has developed this in this letter. The way of grace and faith response. That is the way of Jesus. And that is the way that Paul is explaining to his hearers in Rome. Now we're going to move on in the next presentation to look at some of the remarkable outcomes that come to us arising from this acceptance by God through all that Jesus has done for us.